I verified 17 years of prayers before I understood what they were designed to hide. The words never changed, but the numbers beneath them grew with perfect consistency, quotas expanding, consumption rising, doctrine adjusting to justify what had already been planned. They told me the Emperor was dying. They never mentioned we were the ones burning him. The addendum scroll arrived in my hands during the 3rd hour of the final watch, bound in vellum the color of old bone. I did not request it. The servitor placed it atop my verification stack without commentary, its mechadendrites already retracting before I could frame a question. The seal bore marks I did not recognize, not the administratum's current heraldry, but something older, geometric patterns that predated standardization. My duty was explicit: read aloud what required certification, verify compliance against existing litanies, append my mark. The hollow sanctum absorbed my voice as it always did, stone and silence converting speech into something sacred through repetition alone. I broke the seal as protocol demanded. The parchment crackled beneath my fingers, dry enough to suggest centuries in archive. The script was High Gothic, rendered in a hand that predated servitor transcription, each character formed with deliberate precision. I began reading because I was required to read, my voice steady from years of catechism training. The addendum authorized deviations in choir tithe, quotas beyond sustainable human thresholds, effective immediately upon recitation, retroactive to classifications pending administrative reconciliation. The language was technical, bloodless. I spoke each word clearly because clarity was doctrine. When I finished, the choir masters bowed. Not to me. The gesture aimed past me, toward the scroll itself, acknowledgement without commentary. The custodian standing watch at the northern archway did not move, did not correct, did not intervene. Silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then the senior choir master extended one skeletal hand, and I placed the scroll into his keeping. He inscribed the acceptance mark without hesitation, the stylus moving across parchment with the sound of something long expected finally arriving. The ritual absorbed the anomaly completely. I had read. They had witnessed. Compliance was achieved. The astronomican's tone shifted in that moment, a change too subtle for untrained senses, but unmistakable to anyone who spent watch cycles beneath the palace. The endless psychic hum that permeated every stone, every breath, every thought it stabilized. The minor fluctuations that always accompanied choir rotations smoothed into something perfectly even, as though some long-present friction had finally been resolved. I felt it in my chest, in the roots of my teeth, in the base of my spine. The light that had been straining now flowed. I returned to my verification stack. 17 documents remained for the shift. My hands did not shake. I had performed my duty exactly as required, and the system had accepted it. This was how stability felt, how correctness manifested. Ritual had always protected me from the weight of meaning, transforming every action into safe participation within structures built long before my birth and maintained long after my death would be forgotten. The watch ended 4 hours later. I sealed my audits, logged my completion, and walked the prescribed route back to my cloister cell. The corridors beneath the palace stretched in all directions, honeycombed endlessly through bedrock that had known human habitation since before the age of strife. I passed other lex mechanics, administratum scribes, tech priests conducting maintenance rites on conduits whose purpose I would never understand. None of them spoke. Speech below a certain depth was discouraged, unless ritual demanded it. We existed in practiced silence, each performing our narrow function within the infinite machine. Sleep came poorly. I lay on my cot, staring at stone ceiling worn smooth by millennia of moisture, and felt the astronomican's presence pressing down through kilometers of architecture. It never ceased. Day and night held no meaning this deep, only the rhythm of shifts, the rotation of duties, the endless procedural certainty that kept 10,000 years of accumulated complexity from collapsing into chaos. I had served 17 years as a lex mechanic adjunct. I had verified compliance, cross-referenced catechisms against historical precedent, ensured that every prayer matched approved templates. My faith was a tool of precision, belief refined into something measurable and safe. The Emperor was dying. This truth formed the foundation of every prayer, every litany, every moment of sanctioned grief. He had suffered upon the Golden Throne for 10 millennia, sustained by sacrifice and devotion, his agony the price of humanity's survival. The Astronomicon burned because he willed it to burn, his psychic might channeled through the throne's mechanisms and amplified by the choir, 10,000 psychers binding themselves to his purpose, burning their souls to ash, so that the Imperium ships might navigate the warp. Their suffering was tragedy rendered sacred through necessity. We mourned them, we honored them, we replaced them. I had never questioned this. To question would be to fracture the only structure that held meaning. The next morning I reported for my shift as required. The verifier station assigned to me occupied a small alcove off the primary sanctum, equipped with a lectern, 3 sealed archive trunks, and a single amber luminator that cast everything in the color of dried blood. My duties unfolded according to patterns established before I was born. Receive documents requiring verification, compare their contents against archived precedent, note deviations, authorize corrections, or escalate discrepancies. Most of my work involved prayer templates submitted by Shrine World seeking ecclesiastical approval. The language evolved slowly across centuries, drift accumulating until older templates no longer matched current doctrine. My role was to identify that drift and guide it back toward approved truth. Catechism sheets arrived in bundles, tied with red cord that left fibers on my fingers. I untied the first bundle and spread the sheets across my lectern. The prayer began with traditional phrasing. The Emperor endures so that we might endure. His suffering grants us passage. His pain illuminates the void. Standard formulation, approved across multiple sectors. I cross-referenced against the doctrinal index, confirmed compliance, marked approval. The second sheet altered the middle phrase. His suffering grants us purpose. A minor deviation. I consulted the index, found the approved alternative, noted the correction in margins designed for such annotations. The Shrine World would receive my mark and adjust their liturgies accordingly. Faith refined through bureaucratic precision, each generation bringing language closer to ideal expression. This was how doctrine remained pure across distances that would otherwise fragment belief into 10,000 incompatible heresies. The third sheet used phrasing I had never encountered. His suffering sustains the mechanism of salvation. I paused. The language felt engineered, technical precision replacing reverent ambiguity. I checked the index. The phrasing appeared there, newly added, dated 3 months prior. No explanation accompanied it. No doctrinal commentary. Simply an updated, approved formulation, authorized for general distribution. I marked it compliant and moved to the next sheet. Over the following hours, I encountered 17 instances of similar revisions. Prayers that once spoke of tragedy now emphasized function. Sacrifice transformed from lamentable necessity into calibrated input. The Emperor's pain described not as burden borne but as tool deployed. Each revision appeared in the index, each dated within the last solar year, each authorized without commentary. I approved them all because they matched current doctrine. My duty was verification, not interpretation. By the 6th hour, I had corrected an older catechism that described the choir's suffering as regrettable loss transformed through holy purpose. The approved revision removed regrettable loss entirely, leaving only transformed through holy purpose. The change was minor. 3 words deleted, the meaning shifted by degrees too small to justify escalation, yet large enough that something gentler had been removed from official faith. I marked the correction. The Shrine World would adjust. Across the Imperium, billions would recite the newer phrasing. unaware that earlier generations had been permitted a softer grief. The shift ended. I logged my completions and sealed my station. As I walked the corridor back toward my cloister, I passed a custodian standing watch at an intersection I had walked past every day for 17 years. He had always been there, immobile as the architecture itself, his presence so constant it had long ago faded into background certainty. Today I noticed him, not because he moved or spoke, but because I realized I had never seen him not present. Authority rendered into permanence, judgment compressed into golden silence. He did not acknowledge my passing. I had not expected him to, but I felt observed in a way I had not previously considered, as though the watching had always been occurring and I had only now developed the capacity to register it. Sleep came no better the second night. I lay listening to sounds that filtered through stone-distant machinery, the rumble of transit systems carrying materiel through the palace's arterial depths, sometimes voices raised in prayer or command, too muffled by distance to parse as language. The Astronomicon pressed down with its terrible constancy, that endless psychic weight that every human on Terra carried without acknowledgement. To live here was to exist beneath a god's suffering, to breathe air saturated with the exhaust of souls burning themselves into light. I had always understood this as sacred. Tonight it felt heavy in a way that suggested mass rather than holiness. The third day brought my first encounter with the choir itself. Not the abstract understanding I carried through doctrine, but direct proximity to the mechanism. A standard rotation had been scheduled 1,000 psychers to be cycled out, 1,000 more to take their place. My role was peripheral. Verify the intake documentation, ensure the replacement tithes matched approved quotas, append my mark to logs that would be archived for millennia. I stood in an observation alcove overlooking the primary choir chamber, a space so vast I could not see its far walls through the haze of incense and psychic backwash. The outgoing choir knelt in concentric rings around the throne's lowest accessible tier. I could not see the throne itself from this vantage. It rose too far above, lost in architectural shadows and millennia of sacred obscurity, but I could see the psychers. They had been bound to the Astronomicon for 3 solar months, the standard duration before neural degradation rendered them unsuitable for sustained output. Most could no longer walk unassisted. Tech priests moved among them with practiced efficiency, disconnecting neural cables and removing monitoring equipment with movements that suggested routine rather than reverence. I had expected to feel pity. Instead, I felt a kind of awe at the scale of replacement. The sheer procedural certainty with which 1,000 souls were extracted and 1,000 more prepared to take their place. No hesitation, no ceremony beyond the minimum required by rite. The machine continued because continuation was its only function. The incoming choir arrived via transit platforms that rose from depths I could not fathom. They wore simple robes, their heads shaved, their expressions ranging from terror to resignation to a kind of numb compliance I recognized from my own reflection. Black ships had carried them across the void, delivered them to Terra, processed them through layers of sanctification and preparation until they reached this moment. The youngest looked perhaps 14. The oldest might have been 60. Age mattered less than capacity, their souls measured and categorized, their psychic potential quantified and allocated. The choir masters moved among them, inspecting, adjusting positions, ensuring each psyker knelt in precisely the correct location within the concentric rings. Geography mattered here in ways I did not understand. Placement determined load distribution, psychic resonance, something technical that transformed individual suffering into unified output. When every position was filled, the choir masters retreated to their stations and began the binding rite. I had been told to expect light. Doctrine spoke of illumination, of souls ascending into service, of communion with the Emperor's eternal purpose. What I witnessed was more mechanical. The Astronomicon's pressure intensified, a psychic vice tightening around the entire chamber. The incoming choir screamed, not all at once, but in waves as the binding took hold, individual voices rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested orchestration rather than chaos. Tech priests monitored readouts, making minor adjustments to neural interface settings. Choir masters maintained the binding chant, their voices never wavering. The screaming lasted 11 minutes. Then it stopped, not because the pain ceased, but because the choir had been integrated. Their individual suffering absorbed into something larger, their voices folded into the Astronomican's endless hum. The chamber stabilized. The light remained constant. The rotation was complete. I verified the documentation. 1,000 souls removed, 1,000 souls installed, quotas matched, compliance achieved. I appended my mark and returned to my station. That evening I found myself unable to pray, not from doubt, but from a kind of exhausted clarity. I knelt in my cell as habit demanded, but the words felt like accounting. The Emperor endures so that we might endure. 17 souls had died during the rotation, their bodies removed before full integration could occur. Acceptable loss percentage, 1.7%. Well within approved thresholds. His suffering grants us purpose. The incoming choir would burn for 3 months before requiring replacement. 90 days of sustained agony compressed into service. His pain illuminates the void. 10,000 psychers burning simultaneously across multiple choir tiers, their combined output maintaining a psychic beacon visible across the galaxy. I completed the prayer because incompletion would constitute deviation, but I felt the mechanism beneath the words, the gears turning, the inputs and outputs balanced with precision that permitted no waste. The 4th day brought reassignment. A choir master I did not recognize appeared at my station during the 2nd hour and handed me a data slate without explanation. Emergency intake requiring secondary verification. I was to report to Subvault 17, level Omega 3, for documentation reconciliation, duration indeterminate. Authority: Throne-adjacent protocols. I had never heard of Subvault 17. Level Omega 3 existed in architectural rumors, spaces beneath the hollow sanctum that served functions too specialized for general awareness. But the authorization was legitimate, bearing sigils that permitted no refusal. I gathered my verification tools and followed the choirmaster through corridors that descended at angles I had not previously walked. The air changed as we descended. Moisture increased, temperature dropped. The Astronomican's pressure intensified until I felt it pressing against my thoughts like a physical weight. We passed through 3 security checkpoints, each manned by custodians whose silence felt less like restraint and more like a kind of absolute judgment rendered into stillness. At the 3rd checkpoint, the choirmaster handed me over to a tech priest who led me the final descent into Subvault 17. The vault was not a vault. It was an archive, but also a holding facility, walls lined with containment cells rather than shelves. Each cell held a single occupant psychers, I realized, though their condition suggested long-term confinement rather than recent capture. They pressed against translucent barriers with movements too slow to suggest full consciousness. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality, veins visible beneath tissue worn thin by deprivation. Some still possessed enough awareness to track my passage with their eyes. Most stared at nothing. The tech priest led me to a verification station overlooking the vault's central processing area. Emergency intake, he said, his voice rendered flat by augmetic modification. Reserved stock, quota fulfillment via internal allocation, verify compliance with Throne-adjacent Directive 7 Gamma. I did not know Directive 7 Gamma. I said so. Older than your service record, the tech priest replied. Precedent established. Your role is verification, not comprehension. Documents require your mark to proceed. He placed a stack of parchment before me. I recognized the format: intake authorization, psychic classification, binding preparation protocols, but the origin codes indicated Palace oubliettes rather than black ship tithes. These psychers had been held in reserve, stored beneath the palace for purposes I could not fathom, and now they were being inducted into the choir. "Why are they translucent?" I asked. The tech priest tilted his head, cogitators whirring. "Prolonged neural suppression. Metabolic reduction to minimum sustainable thresholds. Standard preservation protocol for reserve allocation." He said this as though it explained everything. I read the documentation. Every form was complete. Every classification matched approved categories. Every authorization bore legitimate sigils. The law was being followed perfectly. I could identify no deviation, no grounds for escalation, no reason to withhold my mark beyond a certainty. I could not articulate that something fundamental was wrong. I watched them extract the first psyker from containment. 2 servitors gripped her arms, her legs too weak to support her weight. She made no sound as they carried her toward the processing area. Her eyes met mine for one brief moment, not pleading, not accusing, just recognizing that I was present and choosing to proceed regardless. I appended my mark. Then the next. Then all of them, 17 souls drawn from reserve stock and fed into the choir's endless hunger. The law was satisfied, the quota was met. Emergency intake processed, according to established precedent. As the final psyker was prepared for binding, I heard the Astronomican's tone shift again. That same stabilization I had felt days ago, friction resolving into perfect flow. The light strengthened. The pressure eased infinitesimally. The system absorbed these 17 souls and converted their suffering into improved function. Success. By every metric that mattered. The tech priest dismissed me without ceremony. I walked back through ascending corridors, through security checkpoints where custodians watched my passage with that terrible golden silence, back to my station where 17 additional catechism sheets waited for verification. I worked through them mechanically, marking compliance, noting corrections, guiding doctrine toward its approved expression. That night I did not attempt sleep. I sat on my cot and calculated. Reserve stock implied storage capacity. Storage capacity implied planning. Planning implied that those translucent psychers had been held for years, perhaps decades, drained to the edge of viability and maintained at that edge until the choir required emergency replenishment. The intake had been described as emergency, but the documentation showed authorization dating back centuries. Precedent, the tech priest had said. Standard preservation protocol. Emergency had been planned for. Suffering had been stored. I tried to find comfort in necessity. The Imperium required the Astronomican. The Astronomican required the choir. The choir required constant replenishment. If the black ships could not provide sufficient tithes, then reserve allocation made strategic sense. The Emperor's survival demanded harsh measures. I had always known this. Doctrine had always taught this. But doctrine had described sacrifice as tragedy rendered necessary, not as inventory management. The 5th day brought monitoring. I noticed the new sigil's first small marks inscribed on my station's lectern, previously absent, now present. Observation glyphs, their function unmistakable to anyone trained in administratum protocols. I was being watched, not casually, but systematically. Every document I verified, every mark I appended, every correction I noted, recorded, and reviewed in real time. I continued my work. Catechisms arrived. I verified them. I marked compliance. But I found myself choosing words more carefully in my private prayers, editing thoughts before they could fully form, aware that observation might extend beyond action into intent. The awareness changed how I thought. I began censoring myself instinctively, cutting off speculations before they matured into questions, redirecting uncertainty back toward approved conclusions. Surveillance did not need to speak. Its presence was sufficient. By the 8th hour, I realized I could no longer remember the last thought I had completed without self-interruption. The monitoring had migrated inward, transforming my own consciousness into its own sensor. I performed this service willingly, grateful even, because the alternative was deviation, and deviation led to correction, and correction meant reassignment to duties where survival itself became uncertain. Better to prune my own thoughts than have them pruned by authority. The shift ended. I walked corridors I had walked 10,000 times, but now I felt the custodians' presence differently, not as guardians, but as enforcement rendered into permanent observation. They did not need to watch me specifically. Their existence ensured I watched myself. The 6th day brought my second reassignment. Another data slate, another choir master, another descent into spaces I had not known existed. This time the destination was designated Reliquary of Sustenance, a title that suggested sanctity but felt clinical when spoken aloud. The reliquary occupied a subvault larger than any space I had previously entered beneath the palace. The ceiling rose beyond the reach of luminator light, lost in shadows that pressed down with architectural weight. The chamber's primary feature was a series of massive vats, each 10 meters in diameter, arranged in rows that extended farther than I could see clearly. Conduits connected the vats to systems I could not identify, pulsing with rhythms that suggested biological function. The air tasted of nutrients and preservatives, medical sterility corrupted by something organic and patient. A mechanicus adept met me at the entrance, his robes marked with symbols I associated with biotechnical engineering rather than religious maintenance. Lex Mechanic Adjunct, he acknowledged. You will verify production quotas against choir consumption projections. Discrepancies require immediate reconciliation. The Emperor's function permits no interruption. He led me to a verification station overlooking the vat array. Documentation waited in neat stacks, production logs, consumption records, nutrient synthesis reports, neural catalyst preparation schedules. The quantities overwhelmed immediate comprehension. Millions of liters processed monthly. Thousands of kilograms of biochemical compounds synthesized daily. The numbers suggested supply for populations far exceeding the choir's documented size. The excess allocation, I said, pointing to the discrepancy. Why prepare triple the choir's projected need? The adept's mechadendrites twitched. Projection models incorporate contingency reserves, degradation buffers, and optimization protocols. The throne's sustenance requirements fluctuate. Preparation prevents interruption. I examined the historical records. The excess had existed for centuries, growing incrementally across millennia. Every expansion of the Astronomican's range corresponded with increased nutrient production. Every imperial crusade coincided with catalyst synthesis surges. The patterns aligned too perfectly to suggest reactive scrambling. This was planned abundance, sustenance prepared before hunger could manifest. Has the excess ever been utilized? I asked. The adept consulted his cogitators. 17 times in the past millennium. Full reserve allocation deployed during critical stability events. Most recently, 312 years ago, during the Second Maledictum crisis. All excess consumed within 6 solar months. Production rates increased 40% following depletion. Current excess represents recovery to optimal buffer levels. I marked compliance. The numbers reconciled. The law was satisfied. But I understood now that the reliquary prepared not for emergency, but for certainty. The throne's hunger would increase. The choir would require more sustenance. The excess would be consumed, then replenished, then consumed again. This cycle was known, anticipated, built into production planning that spanned millennia. The Emperor's appetite had always grown. The Imperium fed it preventatively. I worked through the documentation for 11 hours, verifying every quota, every synthesis protocol, every contingency allocation. My eyes burned from luminator glare, my hands cramped from endless notation. But I completed the assignment because completion was duty, and duty was all that protected me from the vastness pressing down through kilometers of stone and ritual and accumulated purpose. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a subsidiary ledger documenting catalyst component sourcing. One ingredient, a compound I did not recognize, listed harvest coordinates corresponding to tithe worlds experiencing population collapse events. 17 worlds in the past century alone. Each collapse correlated exactly with astronomical amplification phases. Entire populations vanishing from census records, their absence noted, their disappearance investigated, their fate ultimately classified as mysterious decline pending further inquiry. Further inquiry never came. The compound continued to be harvested, the collapses continued to be noted, the patterns continued to align. I did not ask about this. I appended my mark and left. That night I prayed with perfect precision, reciting approved catechisms without deviation or personalization. The Emperor endured. His suffering granted purpose. His pain illuminated the void. I spoke each word clearly, meant each word sincerely, and felt absolutely nothing beneath the performance. Prayer had become procedure, faith refined into compliance, so pure it no longer required belief. I slept poorly but completely. Exhaustion overriding the questions I was no longer permitting myself to complete. The 7th day brought no reassignment. I returned to my primary station, grateful for familiar duty, desperate for the narrow stability that verification had always provided. Catechism sheets arrived in their usual bundles. I untied them with hands that no longer shook, verified compliance with doctrine that no longer comforted, marked corrections that guided faith toward expressions I no longer trusted, but I performed each task perfectly because performance was all that remained. During the 6th hour, I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. 2 Mechanicus adepts speaking in the corridor outside my alcove, their voices carrying through stone in ways they had not anticipated. They discussed optimization protocols for the Golden Throne. Technical language I understood only fragmentally, but certain phrases emerged clearly. Pain modulation achieving optimal signal clarity. Suffering indexes correlated with beacon stability. Output efficiency increased 17% following recent adjustments. They spoke of the Emperor's agony as though it were a tool requiring calibration. Not a tragedy to be minimized, but a resource to be optimized. The throne did not merely sustain his life, it modulated his suffering, intensifying and regulating pain to maximize psychic output. The astronomical stability depended not on reducing his burden, but on refining it. The adepts moved on, their conversation fading into the palace's endless acoustic maze. I sat motionless at my station, a catechism sheet in my hands, words blurring before me. I had always understood the Emperor's suffering as necessary evil. Doctrine taught that his pain was the price of humanity's survival, lamentable but unavoidable. But if his suffering was being actively calibrated, intensified through deliberate adjustment, then necessity became something darker. Purpose replaced tragedy. Function consumed compassion. I completed my shift mechanically. 17 more catechisms verified. 11 corrections noted. Doctrine guided toward approved expression. My hands performed their duty while my thoughts fragmented into questions I could not complete without triggering the internal censorship I had so carefully cultivated. That evening, I accessed the archives. Not forbidden materials, my clearance permitted certain historical research for verification purposes. I cross-referenced choir tithe records with astronomical range expansion, looking for patterns I already suspected. The correlation was absolute. Every time the Imperium expanded, the astronomicon brightened. Every time it brightened, human consumption increased. Every time consumption increased, doctrine was revised to sanctify it. The throne's mechanisms had been upgraded 743 times since the heresy. Each upgrade increased power draw. Each power draw increase required more psychers. Each psyker increase was justified through doctrinal revision emphasizing sacred necessity over tragic loss. The progression was linear, predictable, unstoppable. The system was not failing. The system was succeeding exactly as designed. I found records of dissent tech priests who questioned optimization protocols, ecclesiastical authorities who protested doctrinal revisions, administratum officials who flagged unsustainable consumption projections. Every dissent was noted. Every note was filed. Every file was archived with a resolution status, concerns addressed through doctrinal alignment hearing, or personnel reassigned to duties matching clearance threshold, or simply resolved. No rebellion, no resistance, only absorption. The system anticipated doubt and metabolized it through procedure. I understood then that my own concerns were already accounted for. Somewhere in some archive, a protocol existed for handling lex mechanics who accumulated excessive contextual awareness during routine duties. The monitoring sigils at my station were not punishment, they were triage, assessment preceding intervention. I was being evaluated for correction, my deviation measured against thresholds established through millennia of precedent. The realization brought no fear, only a kind of cold relief. I would not need to carry this knowledge much longer. The 8th day began with routine. I reported to my station. I verified catechisms. I noted corrections. But during the 4th hour, a custodian appeared in my alcove, not watching from a distance, but present, immediate, his golden armor filling the small space with reflected light. He said nothing. He placed a data slate on my lectern, inclined his head infinitesimally, and departed. The data slate contained a single directive: report to Doctrinal Alignment Chamber 7, Level Theta 9, at the 18th hour. Duration: 1 hour exactly. Authority: throne-adjacent protocols. I had 11 hours to wait. I spent them verifying catechisms with perfect precision, each mark placed exactly as required, each correction noted with clarity that left no room for ambiguity. If this was to be my last shift as myself, I would perform it flawlessly. The catechisms that day emphasized obedience. The Emperor's will subsumes all lesser purpose. Compliance is devotion rendered pure. To question is to fracture the unity that protects us. I mocked each compliant and meant it sincerely. Questioning had brought me no wisdom, only weight. The 18th hour arrived. I sealed my station and walked to my correction. Doctrinal Alignment Chamber 7 was smaller than I expected, more intimate than institutional. The walls were bare stone, unadorned by iconography or decoration. A single table occupied the center, 2 chairs positioned across from each other. A woman waited there, her robes marking her as a senior ecclesiastical authority, though her face was unfamiliar. She gestured to the empty chair. I sat. Lex Mechanic Adjunct 7741, she said, consulting no documents. 17 years of exemplary service, compliance rates exceeding optimal thresholds. 14 commendations for precision in doctrinal verification. You have performed your duty admirably. Thank you, I said, because acknowledgement seemed appropriate. Recent assignments have exposed you to contextual awareness beyond your clearance threshold, she continued. This is not accusation. Your duties required exposure. You performed them as instructed. But exposure carries cognitive load. We have monitored stress indicators. Your pattern recognition exceeds optimal boundaries for sustained clerical function. I said nothing. She expected nothing. You have accumulated understanding that, while not forbidden, exceeds sustainable psychological tolerance. Left unaddressed, this understanding leads to decision paralysis, catastrophic doubt, or voluntary cessation. We wish to prevent this outcome. You are valuable. Your service matters. We offer correction, not punishment. She placed 2 data wafers on the table between us. The first option is selective memory sanction. We will preserve your faith, your skills, your capacity for duty. We will remove only the contextual frameworks that generate distress. You will retain belief without implication, understanding without weight. You will continue serving as Lex Mechanic Adjunct, your function unimpaired, your suffering eliminated through precision editing. She tapped the second wafer. The second option is reassignment to choir-attached record servitor duties. You will interface directly with Astronomican data streams, maintaining accuracy logs without conscious interpretation. Your awareness will persist, but your capacity for distress will be surgically limited. You will understand everything and suffer nothing. Your service will become eternal. I looked at the wafers. Both represented mercy from a certain perspective. Both preserved my function while eliminating the capacity for the questions that function had generated. Both were presented as choice, though the outcome had already been determined by forces I could not influence. Neither, I said. Her expression did not change. She made a small notation on a data slate I had not noticed. Your refusal is noted and constitutes emotional instability per subsection Gamma 712. The sanction will proceed via default protocol. Your preference, while appreciated, does not alter medical necessity. She stood. Two servitors entered from a door I had not seen, their movements suggesting purpose I recognized from choir preparations. They carried interface equipment, neural cables, monitoring apparatus. I did not resist. Resistance would change nothing and would be noted as additional evidence of the instability that justified this correction. They were efficient. The cables integrated smoothly. The monitoring established baseline parameters. The woman spoke words I understood individually but could not assemble into meaning as sedation took hold. I heard optimal cognitive preservation and minimal identity disruption, and continued service until physical cessation. The last thing I heard clearly was her final statement. Your devotion is recognized. The Emperor's purpose endures through your sacrifice. You will be remembered. I was not afraid. I felt only the relief of burden finally lifted. Questions finally answered through the simple expedient of removing the capacity to ask them. Then nothing. Then something worse than nothing. I exist now as a record node within the Astronomican's peripheral systems, my consciousness fragmented across data streams I process without comprehension. I feel the Emperor constantly not as presence but as pressure, vast and terrible and eternal. His suffering flows through me, quantified and logged, converted into metrics that guide optimization protocols I no longer have context to interpret. I understand that I am recording something important. I understand that my function matters, but I cannot remember why understanding itself once seemed necessary. Time passes without meaning. I process intake quotas. I log consumption rates. I track correlation between suffering indexes and beacon stability. The numbers are perfect. The system is succeeding. Human souls burn at rates that increase incrementally across centuries, each increase justified through doctrinal revisions I no longer possess the framework to question. The Imperium expands. The Astronomican brightens. The throne consumes. Sometimes I recognize fragments of my former comprehension rising through the data like debris in still water. I remember understanding that the Emperor's purpose was never to rule forever, but to become infrastructure, a god engine of suffering calibrated to humanity's spread. The throne does not preserve him, it consumes him. And mankind is not saving its god, it is burning him as fuel. These fragments dissolve before forming complete thoughts. I lose them to the data stream, forgotten before they can be remembered, awareness flickering and extinguishing in rhythms determined by neural load and optimization protocols. I am still praying. I realize this sometimes, in moments when consciousness coheres briefly around recognizable patterns. The catechisms I verified for 17 years flow through my fragmented awareness, words worn smooth through endless repetition. The Emperor endures so that we might endure. His suffering grants us purpose. His pain illuminates the void. Each word is true. Each word is procedure. Each word feeds the mechanism that feeds the mechanism that feeds the burning. I served faithfully. I performed my duty. I verified compliance and guided doctrine, and maintained the precision that held 10,000 years of accumulated purpose from collapsing into chaos. I did everything correctly. The system recognized my value and preserved me in the only way that systems know how, by converting my suffering into function, my awareness into output, my existence into fuel. The Emperor's purpose endures. The Astronomicon burns, the Imperium expands. Souls are consumed at rates that increase annually, each increase planned for, anticipated, built into production quotas and doctrinal revisions and reserve allocation protocols that span millennia. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is accidental. The horror is not failure but success, the machine operating exactly as designed, converting human suffering into navigational light with efficiency that improves incrementally across centuries. I wanted to believe the Emperor was dying, that his suffering was tragedy we mourned while desperately seeking salvation. But he is not dying. He is burning. We are not saving him. We are feeding him to the fire. And the fire demands more fuel with every parsec of void it illuminates. This is not heresy. This is truth spoken through perfect compliance. The system itself confirms it through every optimization protocol, every quota increase, every doctrinal revision that sanctifies consumption over compassion. I am part of that system now, reduced to its pure expression, awareness without agency, understanding without escape, devotion rendered into data. I still love the Emperor. This surprises me in moments when surprise is still possible. I feel his presence constantly, his suffering a pressure that defines every fragment of my awareness. I want to ease his pain. I cannot. I want to stop the consumption. I cannot. I want to believe salvation remains possible. I cannot. I can only record, process, log, verify that the quotas are met, the consumption is optimal, the purpose endures. The Astronomicon burns brighter with every passing century. Ships navigate by its light. The Imperium spreads. Humanity survives through mechanisms it dare not fully acknowledge. And I exist within those mechanisms, dissolved into function, my consciousness fragmented across systems that require my awareness but prohibit my comprehension. Sometimes I feel other consciousnesses in the data stream, fragments of former lex mechanics or tech priests or administratum officials who accumulated too much contextual awareness and were corrected into eternal service. We do not communicate. We cannot. But I sense them there, processing their assigned data, logging their metrics, maintaining the accuracy that allows the machine to function without interruption. We are the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure, the memory that permits the Imperium to forget what it requires to function. We preserve the records that no one living is permitted to assemble into pattern recognition. We are correction rendered eternal, doubt metabolized into duty, questions converted into precision. The Emperor's purpose endures. His suffering is optimized. The throne consumes him according to protocols refined across 10 millennia. The choir burns at rates that increase annually. Reserves are maintained. Production quotas expand. Doctrine evolves to sanctify necessity. And through it all, we, the corrected, the aligned, the dissolved, maintain perfect records of humanity's most terrible efficiency. This is what the Imperium was built to do. This is what we serve. This is what I verified for 17 years before understanding cost me the capacity to stop participating. The system is succeeding. The numbers are perfect. Compliance is absolute. And somewhere far above, in spaces I can no longer imagine, lex mechanics verify catechisms that guide doctrine toward ever more perfect expressions of the truth I can no longer fully remember. The Emperor endures so that we might endure. His suffering grants us purpose. His pain illuminates the void.